Hello everyone, my name is Satwik. I'm a PhD student from TU Delft. Today I'm going to talk about my paper with Epema and Stefanie Roos on how Lightning's routing diminishes its anonymity. Before getting into the details, we first briefly describe blockchain and payment channel networks. A blockchain is basically a distributed database or a ledger that is updated only when all users in the system agree to it or consensus is reached, thereby eliminating the need for a centralized authority. For example, in the Bitcoin blockchain, all these new updates are blocks of new transactions. They and it acts as a reliable record of all transactions, and thereby we don't need banks to do that for us. However, most consensus algorithms are computationally heavy. So basically, as a result, blockchains are not as scalable as credit cards or papers. PayPal. Payment channels are a popular solution to overcome the scalability issues of blockchain. Basically, two users here, Bob and Alice, they fund some money from their wallets into creating a payment channel, and they can use the money in the channel to do transactions with each other on the channel. And these transactions do not need consensus as such. Only the opening, closing transaction, and a few periodic commitment transactions required to be stored on the blockchain so that the blockchain can act as a mediator in case of disputes. The Lightning Network is a payment channel network over the Bitcoin blockchain. A payment channel network is basically a network of such payment channels so that two users who do not share a payment channel can always do payments by going over existing payment channels in the network without creating a new one. Lightning ensures that its payments are atomic as well as balance security is maintained by the use of hash time locked contracts or HTLC. So, for example, if Bob wants to make or receive money from Alice, then Bob creates a secret key, computes its hash, keeps the secret key, and sends the hash to Alice. And Alice then locks the payment amount with Bob uh, in its channel. And if Bob reveals the secret key within this lock time, then Alice unlocks the payment and it goes to Bob. However, if Bob reveals the secret later than lock time, then the payment is refunded back to Alice. This can be extended to a multi-hop setting as well. For example, if Eric wants to receive money from Alice, Eric chooses a secret, computes its hash, sends the hash to Alice. Alice then sees that there is no path, the direct channel to Eric, so it computes a path from Bob, Carol, Diana to do the payment. First, Alice locks the payment with Bob, Bob with Carol, Carol with Diana, Diana with Eric, and once Eric reveals the secret to Diana, Diana unlocks the payment to Eric, and Diana then reveals the secret to Carol, Carol unlocks the payment, and finally, Alice, once it receives the secret, it unlocks its payment with Bob, and the payment is complete. Now, we have to take care that each node has enough time to raise a dispute in the blockchain in case of any malicious activity. So that is taken care by the computation of the time lock for each node on the path. Here, the total time lock for any node is basically the sum of the time locks of the remainder of the path. For example, Bob's time lock is basic total time lock is basically the time lock of the from Bob to Carol, time lock plus time lock from Carol to Diana, plus time lock from Diana to Eric. Also, intermediary nodes like Bob, Carol, and Diana here, they charge a small amount of fee for doing participating in such a protocol, and that fee is borne by Alice or the sender. In terms of anonymity, Lightning uses onion routing or layered encryption like Tor to ensure that intermediaries do not know the senders and the recipients, only their immediate neighbors. And however, unlike Tor, Lightning uses specific pathfinding protocols rather than random intermediaries. Specifically, Lightning is a source routing protocol in which the source route finds the perfect route based on Dijkstra's in such a way that the cost function assigns each channel or edge weights based on the HTLC time locks, channel fees, and the transaction amounts. LND, C Lightning, and Eclair are the three most common implementations of Lightning, and they differ in the specifications of their cost functions. In this paper, we develop an attack to such that an adversary who is an intermediary of a transaction is able to infer senders and recipients of the transaction. We reinforce our attack by using a simulation study on a real world lightning snapshot. We also consider multiple colluding adversaries and how they could improve the attack. We also see whether lightning's existing defense mechanisms is resilient to the attack. The adversary here is an honest but curious adversary who follows the protocol. Whenever it sees a transaction going through it, it just uses the public information about the network and as well as its knowledge about the transaction to infer the sender and the recipient of the transaction. Subsequently, the goals of the adversary is to ensure that the sender anonymity set always has the sender as well as the receiver as anonymity set always has the recipient. The adversary also wants to attack as many transactions as possible and of course minimize the set of size of the anonymity sets. So in brief, so if we have a network and for example here the red node is the adversary sees any transaction and basically tries to infer the sender and the receiver of the transaction. We work in two phases over here. In the first phase, the adversary sees the total time lock seen by the adversary and uses that to construct paths to all possible destinations with this total time lock and consequently finds possible destinations. However, doing a depth first search in such a large graph is computationally expensive, and so we limit the hop count from the adversary successor to d hops or d plus 1 hops from the adversary. In phase 2, for each potential recipient that we found in phase 1, we are going to search for potential senders for that. Basically, all senders that would go through the adversary's predecessor, the adversary, and its successor to reach the recipient would be considered as a potential sender or included in the sender anonymity set. So, for example, if we have a similar graph like before, and the numbers here indicate basically the time log delay that going through this node would indicate. So, for example, the time log delay for going through the adversary is 2, and the delay for example, if a transaction has a time lock delay 9 before reaching the adversary and 7 after reaching the adversary then looks for all paths going through the next node after the adversary successor that have a time lock delay of 7, and we find that these two could be potential recipients and consequently move to phase 2 to find potential senders. We simulated to validate our attack, to evaluate our attack, sorry, we simulated transactions on a snapshot of Lightning using Python to simulate LNDC Lightning and Eclair. The transactions had random sender recipient pairs, and we had a total of 21 adversaries out of the almost 5,000 nodes with a mixture of well-connected, poorly connected, as well as random nodes. And each adversary generated sender and recipient anonymity sets independently. We use three settings: LND only, in which all nodes used LND; clients known, in which all nodes used, the adversary knew which clients the nodes were using; blind, in which the adversary did not know which clients the nodes were using. The depth at which we stopped in phase 1 of the attack was three hops after the successor node to the adversary. The code can be found in this link. Please check it out. The metrics we used to evaluate our results were basically, first of all, the size of the anonymity sets, the proportion of transactions attacked, the proportions of transactions for which the sender and or the recipient was uniquely determined, as well as we wanted to know whether the distance of the adversary for the sender or the recipient would affect the anonymity sizes in any ways. So we looked for the correlation there. When we plotted the anonymity sets sizes for both the sender and the recipient in terms of cumulative distribution function, we found that the sender is uniquely determined nearly 40% of the time when phase 1 is incomplete and 20% of the time when phase 1 is complete. So this means that this implies that when phase 1 is complete, the adversary is closer to the recipient, and thereby the anonymity for the sender is higher, whereas when phase 1 is incomplete, the opposite happens. For the recipient, we almost always uniquely determine the recipient when phase 1 is complete, as it is very close to the adversary, and 20% if it is not complete. Some results of our experiments were over 50% of transactions were attacked by at least one adversary. We uniquely determined the sender for 30% of attack transactions, the recipient for 50% of attack transactions, both for 8% and 7, uh, at least one for 70%. We also observed a strong positive correlation between the adversary's distance from the sender or the recipient and the sender or the recipient anonymity sets, respectively. We also considered that adversaries could collude. So basically, if in the current version of Lightning, where all nodes in the path use the same payment hash, adversaries can communicate with each other and and ensure that they are in the same payment path, and thereby they can share their anonymity sets and compute the intersection to generate smaller anonymity sets. This, however, does not work without payment linkability. For example, like the latest work by Malavolta et al. Suggests a method to avoid payment linkability in Lightning and improves privacy. So, assuming payment linkability, we computed the source anonymity as well as the destination recipient anonymity. We found that when we considered results from all adversaries, the the source was uniquely determined nearly 50% of the time, whereas when we only considered adversaries who completed phase one, the source was determined less than 10% of the time. When for the recipient anonymity sets, the adversaries who completed phase one uniquely determined the source excess of 80% of the time, and all adversaries determined them in excess of 90% of the time. Lightning has implemented a defense against this kind of an attack, and it's called shadow routing, where the sender adds a random value to the total time block. This means that the adversary cannot see the true total time lock to the recipient in the sense that it does not know how far the recipient is anymore. So when we execute phase one, we cannot anymore rely on the total time lock. So we just look for all recipients that are at a certain depth from the adversary. We observe that shadow routing does not affect much the source anonymity sets because it really does not do anything with phase two. However, with phase one, it really affects phase one, and therefore the recipient anonymity sets are much higher compared to without shadow routing. For the future, we want to extend the attack to work with multipath routing protocols as well, which should not be too hard, as well as we need to look for other defenses like adding extra hops and looking for and thinking about rendezvous points. Basically, shadow routing has a problem in the sense that the time lock values are already too high, and shadow routing adds an even higher time lock to the existing values, which is not ideal for most users, and we need to look for other defenses possible. Some related work in this topic are by Tikhomorov. Um, the first paper shows an attack in which if the node right after the sender and node right before the recipient are compromised, then the anonymity could be compromised to a large extent. The second paper by Lisa Muller suggests a timing attack to determine the recipient of a transaction. The third paper by Kapos um, suggests that Lightning would not have longer paths, and there is usually only one intermediary in the path. So it naturally assumes that the predecessor is the sender and the successor is the recipient of the transaction. So it it still remains an open question on how to design a routing protocol such that it maintains anonymity as well as does not compromise on its efficiency in terms of low fees or lower path lengths or low time locks. So yeah, we leave that for future work. Thank you, and I'm open for questions.